get started. Thank you all for being here at this civic engagement event. It's quite a turnout. I wasn't expecting as many people, so I'm glad to see you all here. My name is Rafaele Fierro. For those who don't know me, I teach history of government. I run the Civic Engagement Institute. We try to sponsor as many of these kinds of events every year. And I guess my name's become associated with civic engagement on campus, but it's not exactly accurate because the way I look at civic engagement, it's about all of us. It's about students and faculty having ideas, bringing them forward, and we can turn them into events like these. If you're interested in volunteering for the Civic Engagement Institute, if you want to be part of a panel discussion on any given topic that is communal in nature, is community-oriented, let me know. I'm always game to have as many events as we can in one semester in 1 year. So anyway, that is what I wanted to say first. Today, this is the second in a series of events on the presidential election later this year. And the first was a couple weeks back when we talked about the primaries. In fact, next week, I believe it is, Connecticut will vote in their primaries. They want to be president on the Democratic or Republican side. Today we're talking about the Trump phenomenon and what it is all about 8 years later, 8 years after he became president, winning the election in 2016. A third event later in April, I forget the exact date, but we have those posted on the screens across campus, is the actual election. And it looks like it's going to be Joseph Biden versus Donald Trump. And we're going to look at those two candidates and how they are competing, what the polls say, what the issues are. So that's coming up later in April. And then in May, we're going to look at a third-party candidate. Why, though there are a few third parties, they haven't gained much traction. And the Republicans and the Democrats, those two parties continue to dominate. But for today, we're going to look at the Trump phenomenon. And we have actually three panelists, including myself. To my left here is Professor Fauss. He is a history professor as well. He's been here with us a short time, but in the community college system for a very long time. So I look forward to hearing from him, talk a little bit about what explains the rise of Donald Trump. I'll have a few words to say about the Trump phenomenon as well. We have a third professor of theater. This goes to show that civic engagement fits into any discipline. It doesn't have to be history or political science. But he's actually running for office, and he wanted to provide his own experience at the local level running for office in this current political climate. His name is Michael Hinton. Yeah, he teaches theater here at Tungsis. So it's the three of us discussing. We'll begin with Professor Fauss.
Thank you very much. Again, I am Eric Fauss. I teach history and government here at Tungsis. I'm looking forward to speaking to you on what I see as the historical significance and the place of the Trump phenomena in history. So the way I'm going to approach this is to discuss the context, the place where I see Mr. Trump intersecting with historical currents and the places where I see him breaking from them. So really this is kind of like how I as a historian would go to view Mr. Trump. I certainly want to note that my goal here is not to take a particular side with this. I am attempting in my analysis to be neutral, but Mr. Trump is such a polarizing figure that this is a difficult thing certainly to do. People have very strong feelings about the man. So, certainly this is going to be something that to begin with what I see as perhaps one of the most central aspects of what the Trump phenomenon is, and it would be a sense of grievance. And basically, this is something that is manifest in various ways. That I see that the initial, in fact, the initial speech he gave when he launched his campaign in 2016 highlighted the idea that illegal immigrants to the United States are being treated better than native-born people. So this idea of immigrants is an important part of this sense of grievance. The idea that somehow immigrants are being treated better than native-born people. There's also this idea, too, that, for example, the United States is being treated poorly on the world stage. And then, certainly Mr. Trump's own personal grievances, the notion that he himself is being treated very poorly is a whole important part of his politics at this particular moment. Now, certainly this is something that, if you actually look in history, the notion of tapping into the grievances of a part of America goes pretty much back. The modern example of this would really be Richard Nixon. In 1968, Richard Nixon spoke of a silent majority. This was the idea that there was a group of people who just weren't being listened to, a group of people who were not being acknowledged by the politics of the time. And this, in fact, was in the midst of great chaos and uncertainty related to the Vietnam War, intense social and cultural change. So in many ways, I actually think we're still in this particular moment in which there are groups of Americans who feel that the culture has changed in a way that has left them behind. Certainly you can see this in current conservative politics with significant concerns raised about the visibility of transgender and LGBTQ people. This is certainly, to me, part of this notion of grievance, this sense of that the culture is left behind, has left people behind and their concerns. So really, I actually see this as a continuity. Although, with regards to the personal nature of Mr. Trump's grievances, this is something that I have not really seen a politician bring out the way that he is. And I think that this is something that tends to be a pretty intense part of why his followers, why his supporters support him, out of this notion that he is being treated unfair. So I wanted to move on to the second theme that I see is a big part of the Trump phenomenon, and that is rule breaking. Mr. Trump himself is somebody who has kind of built a mystique around himself as a successful businessman. And I think part of the appeal of this is that he is somebody who is absolutely ruthless. Somebody who does what needs to be done to make the sale, to get it done in this particular case. And certainly as president, there was very innovative ways, for example, of using executive authority, particularly with regards to immigration. That, to me, seems as an example of this kind of like rule-breaking, trying to just really cut through staid, ossified politics. Now, certainly the notion of rule-breaking, though, is something that is still a part of our politics. And I think that I see Mr. Trump and the nature of his rule-breaking as a continuation of something that we have seen in American politics since 1994 in particular. Namely, what I'm referring to is the rise of Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich was a very important political figure, became Speaker of the House, did the contract with America. But a lot of what Gingrich did is pioneer using very hardball tactics in order to make political change, particularly pioneering the use of government shutdowns and other types of tactics like this. This sort of rule-breaking has continued. In particular, Mitch McConnell has been a figure who, as much as he portrays himself as an institutionalist, has in fact engaged in significant rule-breaking, at least with regards to political norms. The most notable example of this is, of course, denying former President Obama a Supreme Court appointment. Now, this is something that goes against the norm because historically, even if we had divided government, it was typically the case that unless a candidate who was appointed was far outside the mainstream, presidents typically got to make Supreme Court appointments. This is something, though, that was changed. And in fact, the rise of the use of the filibuster in the Senate is another example of this. So really, I see that in many ways that this rule-breaking, this really disdain for political norms is something that has been accelerating, even to the point now where many political observers note that the House of Representatives is nearly paralyzed due to the nature of the rule-breaking that is dominating the politics there. So again, but I think that this is something that can be part of the man's appeal. The notion that the rules are there, that they're in the way, they are preventing needed change. Professor Fierro is going to speak more about, though, the appeal of Mr. Trump. So this goes to what I see as another important thing, which represents, to me, an important change, which is the rise of an authoritarian streak. So in particular, this is probably going to be the most controversial part of my remarks because there is still disagreement on the country with regards to particularly the 2020 election. If you are somebody who believes that the 2020 election was stolen, there is certainly nothing that I'm going to tell you that is going to change your mind as to this. But nonetheless, the very fact that Mr. Trump did not accept the results of the 2020 election, declared that there was massive voter fraud, and attempted to subvert the peaceful transfer of power, this is certainly something that is a very, very new, very different thing in American history. The only time that an election was so marred by chaos was really 1876. But that was a bit of a different situation than 2020. Mr. Trump has called for suspending the Constitution. This is something that he tweeted out, or rather posted on Truth Social. This is something that I honestly thought that no political candidate for the highest office in the land would ever do. Certainly, these authoritarian streak, expressing admiration for dictators, is something that is very, very different, something that is new in American politics. Although, if we are going to be looking for continuities, which is what I'm trying to do here, I certainly see some continuity with certain figures in American history. I certainly see Andrew Jackson as a figure who was viewed in very similar ways at the time. Andrew Jackson was derided as King Andrew for his use of innovative executive authority during the bank war. But this was all really part of his appeal. And I do think that the idea of authoritarianism is something which is appealing, considering really the dysfunctional nature of American politics. Recent surveys have shown, in fact, the desire among some for somebody who can break the system. And I do think that this is something which is part of the appeal of the man. And finally, I will conclude my remarks just by noting some other examples, I think, of lacks of continuity. I think that in particular, Mr. Trump's view of the United States, particularly his view of the United States in the world, is an important change from the way American leaders have typically portrayed the United States. In particular, Mr. Trump's view of the world is extremely transactional. It is seen as a fight for survival between countries, in which relationships are based purely upon gain. This I see as very different, because historically, going all the way back to Thomas Jefferson and the founders of the United States, the greatness of the United States has been defined as its values, particularly the idea that the United States is a country that believes in the liberal values of equality, freedom, democracy. And in fact, the notion that American greatness is defined by military power, by economic might, is in many ways something that American leaders have not really envisioned the United States in this particular way. So in many ways, I see this as an important break. And this is not just isolationism. Isolationism is something that does go deeply back into American history. But seeing the world in this particular way, I see as a fundamentally different way of viewing the United States and what makes America great. So with that, I guess I will turn over to Professor Fierro.
Thank you, Professor Fauss. Before I begin my remarks, I just want to let you know that after we're done speaking, we will open it up to questions, comments from you. So we'll give you some time for that. I know that, if I'm not mistaken, both Professors Fauss and have to be out here by 11. Is that right? Yeah, they have class. But I'll be happy to take questions from you, comments, if we don't finish before 11. But I think we will. So let me begin by saying that when I look at this phenomenon, and that's what I'm calling it, you really need to look at these kinds of developments, these patterns in American history, on a multi-tiered basis. And the way political scientists do it sometimes is they look at the personal, the national, and the international. In other words, what's going on that makes Trump himself, the person, appealing to some people? And then what are the forces that are governing American society in the nation, within the country? So the recent occurrences of the more long-term occurrences. And internationally, what's happening in the world that has led to the rise of authoritarianism, that has led to the rise of dissatisfaction among traditional politicians. So those are the three ways in which I want to look at this phenomenon. Starting with the personal, so who is Donald Trump? Well, he's a lot of things. I happen to think he's a chameleon in some ways. He can change shape and form when it fits the time, the period, his convenience. But overall, there's a cult of personality. And for whatever reason, for some reason, there are some who find him charismatic. He identifies with his supporters on an emotional level. That's not true of a lot of politicians. And one of his most famous slogans is, "They're not coming for me, they're coming for you. I'm just in their way." And that makes the support they have for him deeply emotional, almost intimate. And I think that is partly what I mean by this cult of personality. Beyond that, he also has a fix-it mentality. Things are broken, I'm going to fix them. I'm the one to answer your problems. He, in that way, reminds me actually of two historical figures. One, some of you may recall, Ross Perot. He ran for the presidency in 1992, again in 1996, though no one remembers that one because he didn't have a chance. But he was a rich oil man from Texas, billionaire, decided to run for politics, and he commented frequently on the national debt. It was $4 trillion at the time. It's 34 trillion today, but anyway, we'll leave that aside. And he said, the system's broken. I'm going to fix it. That's what he kept saying. I'm going to fix it. And Trump is like that. He can fix things supposedly more than any other political figure. The immigration issue on the border, he's going to fix it. He actually said a few weeks back that the war in Ukraine, if he were president, it would be resolved in 2 days. So that some people find appealing, this fix-it mentality. The second historical figure he reminds me of a little bit is Mussolini. I wouldn't say that Trump is a fascist. I don't know if we want to be or not, but America's institutions would not allow him to be anyway. But Mussolini, it was famously said, made the trains run on time. That efficiency, that productivity is not something you associate with your traditional, typical politician. Trump's not a traditional typical politician. He can get things done in ways that others cannot. And that lots of people find appealing. Professor Fauss mentioned that he is a successful businessman. He actually applied for bankruptcy quite a few times, but that's part of his shtick too, that he applied for bankruptcy because he can game the system and work things to his advantage. But the fact that he's successful, that he's a billionaire, appeals to a lot of people. That this man economically, financially can get things done, and it wouldn't be much of a transition to be successful in the economic realm to the political realm. So those three things, that cult of personality, that fix-it mentality, that successful businessman motif, I would argue makes him appealing to a good chunk of the electorate. But it goes beyond personality, because historical figures, they fit into their time and place. And so what are the forces that govern American society today that have made him appealing, that have made him rise to power? Well, first of all, we've touched on this already, there is this widespread belief that the system is broken. Poll after poll says that. It illustrates the fact that this is what many Americans feel. There's a loss of faith in Congress, the legislative body that makes our laws. There is a widespread belief that our institutions have broken down. I want to show you a couple of graphs to point that out. This is congressional job approval rating from 2000 to the present. Without looking at those specific numbers, you can see the trend is downward. I'm sorry for those of you who in the back having trouble seeing this. My apologies. But what this shows is that Congress's approval rating is in the teens, and it's been there for years now. Let me tell you, at least the last decade, it's been all the way down to 14%, 16%, and another graph that looks at an even longer view will give you another indication of that. You'll see that we're going from a pretty high period, that's after September 11th, where Congress's approval rating shot up, and then has gone down to historically low levels. Even the very disillusioning 1970s didn't have the job approval rating that today's Congress does. And so, to the extent that Congress cannot get things done, well, you need a strong leader. And who's a strong leader? Well, for some, it's Donald Trump. And I should say that beyond that, the president has obtained a lot of power in American political culture since the end of World War II. So this trend is nothing new, but it's just the fact that the extent to which the president has a lot of power, especially in the realm of foreign policy, is unprecedented. And Trump fits into that idea of presidential power. When we talk about faith in America's institution, you see the same downward trend. So it's not just Congress, but it's many of our institutions, from corporations, government in general, the government bureaucracy, however you define our main political and social institutions, most Americans have lost faith in that. And so Trump portrays himself as someone who can either bypass those institutions or correct them. And I think that's part of his appeal as well. If Americans had confidence in Congress, confidence in our political institutions, I doubt he would have gained much traction over the last many years. So again, it's not just the personal, it's how he fits into the national developments of the last decade and beyond. Now, for whom does the system appear broken? Certainly, if you look at those polls and those surveys a little bit more closely, not everyone thinks the same when it comes to our quote-unquote broken system. But white, working class, and conservative men tend to think the system is broken for them especially. And it's those people who've lost faith in our government, and they've gained some faith and trust in Trump. So white, working class, conservative men in particular. Though I will say, recent polls do indicate Trump has made some headway with African Americans, if polls are accurate, and Latino voters as well. So there seems to be changes in the demographics. But for the most part, it's that demographic I just mentioned that hate the elites, especially the elites. I don't know that I've heard that word more than in the last 8 years. In my entire life of studying history, the elites are the problem, and we have to stick it to the elites. I hear that constantly among this disenchanted group. It's these people who feel that the system is rigged. That's another phrase you hear often. The system is rigged, and it's rigged against me. The deck is stacked against me. And that is where Trump really resonates with people, because he is one to talk about the rigged system. Professor Fauss mentioned personally, the system is rigged against him. I don't know that I've ever seen a politician use the word unfair as much as Donald Trump. And it just goes to show how he thinks the system is rigged, but so too do his supporters. I think it goes beyond, though, this idea that the system is rigged, the system is broken. A significant event that has increased distrust is COVID. And in particular, the government's response to COVID. I mean, it was a very gloomy time that we are just coming out, and I think we still feel the after effects of COVID and how businesses were shuttered, schools were closed. Many of you were in school, but at home, and that must have been a very surreal experience. And how we emerge from that is basically having more distrust in the institutions that make society function. And so clearly, this post-COVID idea that things are not quite right, that the government didn't tell us the right things, that did we really need these vaccines, where did the virus come from? That's still in dispute today. Now, whatever you believe in that is not really the point. The point is that there are lots of people who believe that the system is broken, and it especially was broken during COVID. I think also there's been a reaction to a very important movement called the Black Lives Matter movement. And what we saw in the wake of the George Floyd incident, that's the man from Minnesota who was killed, strangled to death by a police officer, is that the Black Lives Matter movement gained ascendancy, but in the last couple of years or so, many white working class men in particular believe that that has gone too far, and that there should be a reaction against BLM, affirmative action programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that kind of response fits in well with supporting Trump, because he's among the first politicians to decry those kinds of things. And I also think on the national level, although this goes beyond the United States, is that a lot of Americans today see politics as entertainment, as spectacle. And if there's one person who was more of an entertainer before he was ever a politician, it's Donald Trump. Right? He had his own show. He is always on the news. He loves the camera. And this is, I think, where we go wrong with our democracy, that we've gone way too far when it comes to thinking that politics is celebrity, that it's show business. It's much more serious than that. And I think that some Americans think, well, this is all just great fun. If you go to a Trump rally, you'll see that very, very kind of environment. Right? So the national level, all those things happening, I think, has led to Trump's appeal as well. What about the international level? I don't want to spend too much time on this, and certainly we can be here all day talking about the distrust of globalization and the institutions that foster globalization. Now, this distrust of institutions from a Western perspective and worldwide has played out differently in different parts of the world. You may recall that in 2014 there was such a thing called the Arab Spring, in which Middle Eastern and Arab nations reacted against their authoritarian regimes from Libya, Syria. Syria is now engaged in a civil war. But lots of these countries, the people there rebelled. It's sometimes called the Facebook Revolution, because most of this played out on social media, which is what led to the downfall of these authoritarian leaders. But in other parts of the world, namely Eastern Europe, authoritarianism has been on the rise. In Poland, in Hungary, and in Russia itself. The article explains Putin's appeal is the same thing that in America explains Trump's, that authoritarianism, the rise of that, as a way to counter these broken institutions. You know, I'm almost out of time, so I kind of want to stop there, but one of the other things, the last thing I want to mention, is that today, a growing phenomenon in the West is a sense of disconnectedness. More people, surveys indicate this through and through, feel alienated and isolated and even lonely. And among Trump supporters, you can see that those who have very few social ties is pretty high. That doesn't mean that everyone who supports Trump is alienated. I don't mean to generalize too much, but there are statistics that say that Trump supporters tend to feel like the system is against them and that they feel isolated perhaps from their communities, from the country at large, and the forces that govern them. But social isolation in America, for both male and female, is on the rise. That first graph in the upper left suggests that upward trend, especially among males, but also among females too. So these are statistics that you can find pretty much everywhere. They all have the same upward trajectory of social isolation. One of the ironies of the modern era, by the way, is the fact that the internet was supposed to connect us to everyone, and yet it's boxed us in. It's made us less trusting of institutions and of each other. And this community breakdown, I find the most disturbing thing, has much less to do with Trump and more to do with us and democracy and what that means for us moving forward. Anyway, those are my remarks. Thank you very much. And now, Professor Hinton.
Can I just see, do we need the microphone for?
Yeah.
Can you guys all hear me all right? Is this okay here? I say this because I'm the theater professor, so if you can't hear me, I got a problem. I wanted to start off just really briefly, if I could take a really quick, messy poll of everybody here. If you have a positive impression of politics, if you have a positive impression of politics, raise your hand. That's pretty much what I expected, right? Is anybody surprised by that? A handful of very optimistic souls, and bless you, thank you, we need you in the process, right? So one of my colleagues here said they were doing this event talking about the Trump phenomenon. I thought it was an important thing to talk about here. I am not a political scientist, I'm not a historian. I can let others speak more authoritatively about those subjects. What I can talk about with some authority and some experience is the Trump phenomenon on a local level, specifically statewide, specifically in Eastern Connecticut, which is where I live. So it's deviating a little bit from Trump, but we're talking about the Trump phenomenon largely there. I want to be very frank at the outset. My boss is here. I am not allowed to talk about political ideology. I'm not espousing one position over another. I'm not telling anybody to be a Democrat or a Republican or anything like that. What I will advocate for is to be more involved in your civic process. We'll talk about that a little bit. But I just want to be very clear at the outset that while I'm talking from my perspective, running from local politics, I am not saying that any one of you should or should not support my personal political ideology. Are we all set there? I'm not going to get in trouble? Okay. We'll find out. All right, so I am currently a member of the Board of Education in my town in Preston in eastern Connecticut. If anybody knows where that is, you know how long of a commute I have to come here to Tungsten every day. It's over by the casinos. My district, my state district, is the 45th House District. That includes the towns of Preston, Griswold, a sliver of Ledyard, a sliver of Lisbon, and all of Voluntown. So north of New London, south of the Quiet Corner, in the middle of nowhere, almost in Rhode Island. That's where I am, right? So when we talk about rural, working class, white populations primarily being very, very popular with Trump, that's my neighborhood. That's my town. That's where I'm from, right? And that's where I'm also running for political office. I'm running for the Democratic candidate in the 45th district against somebody who has very much been an acolyte of Trump, somebody who espouses these ideals on a local level, right? And that's what I want to talk a little bit about here today, right? So again, it's not just about Trump. It's not just about Trump, but the ideas that have come along with it. When we talk about extremism, when we talk about the Trump phenomenon, when we talk about it historically, and also talking about what happens right now, right? And I will argue that this goes all the way back to, as has already been said, to the foundation of our country, right? This idea of freedom versus liberty. How much do we give away for how much security, right? And the difference between those two ideas, freedom versus liberty. It precedes Democrats and Republicans. We can talk about the same debate between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists in the 1780s, right? This goes back again to the founding of our country. I would argue that in a sane world, which many of us probably haven't experienced in our lifetimes, the system is intended to find the best of all of us. There was a time when Congress was considered the greatest deliberative body in the history of the world, right? It was intended to be an institution where the best and brightest of us would go and debate and compromise and put forward ideas that would run the government based off of these compromises, based off of these ideas. Now, that may mean that you have one person on the right, one person on the left, and the truth lies between them. It may mean that there's a fluctuation of ideas, right? But that's how the system is supposed to run. I think what we're alluding to here, when we're talking about what we've all experienced is in the past decade or so, is that there's a rise of extremism. Is that fair to say we've experienced that? Extreme ideas, perhaps on the left and right, perhaps, regardless of who you voted for, ideas that seem very foreign to your ideas, to your values, to your experience, that are perhaps scary to you. Not just a difference of opinion, but ideas that frighten us, perhaps. That's what I'm talking about here today, right? So I'd argue that we fluctuated to extremism when we talk about the Trump ideology. We're not talking about the virtues of democracy. As he said recently, I'd be a dictator on day one. And that's not in favor of democracy. That's not in favor of the government. That's in favor of taking the system down. So it's no longer a debate over the size of our government or what policies are coming into place. And if you're a fan of Trump, you know this, right? Again, I'm not advocating for any particular political ideology, but this is the reality that we currently live in. But when we talk about Trump, I'm talking about the little Trumps. I'm talking about the legacy of Trump. He may or may not win this next election. Either way, his ideology is sticking with us, and people who believe in that ideology are our neighbors, are our family members. They live in our communities, and they have a right to have their voices heard, as does everybody in a democratic process. So it's not just about Trump. And my point is that with a lot of these positions, a lot of this rhetoric, divisive rhetoric, sounds peculiar to Trump, but it is throughout our system right now. So the question is what we do with that. What do we do with that? What do we do with this distrust in Congress and our political life, our political systems? What do we do with this rising interest in tearing the system down? What do we do when we don't trust our leaders? As we've just proven, most of us in this room have a pessimistic perspective of politics. Yeah. I share that pessimism, but I also tend to think that politics is a moral endeavor. Politics is a place that we all can have our voice heard and advocate for our values and advocate for our beliefs, right? Politics as a moral endeavor. I believe that it's a place where we can advocate for our values and make our voices heard. So my experience as a statewide candidate has taught me a couple things. I don't come from privilege or anything like that. I'm a theater professor, right? I'm not what is considered the typical political candidate. But what I will advocate for is to be a bit more audacious in our behaviors and standing up. If we don't like our leaders, let's elect new leaders. They may be in the room right now. And it is a process of getting involved. Voting is important. If you're able to donate to politicians, please donate to politicians who share your values, who support, who you believe in. Knock on doors. Talk to your friends. This is all part of the political process, and this is something that I think we overlook because we perhaps feel like we don't have any power. And we have an extraordinary amount of power. As a local candidate, I can tell you that we listen, and your voice can be heard if you speak up and allow it to be heard. So by standing up here, I'm telling you that in a divisive time, in a divisive era, when distrust in our politics is an all-time high, and cynicism about the direction of our country perhaps is a little bit higher. There is a solution, and that's engagement. That's showing up. That's knocking on doors. That's talking to your politicians. That's running for political office yourselves. I was once a community college student, and again, I don't come from a conventional background. I'm not a lawyer. But if our government, if our society truly belongs to us all, then that means that it has a place for all of us to be heard and all of us to participate. And I believe that when we talk about the Trump phenomenon and the rise of extremism in our politics, the only reason that's become so successful is because we haven't shown it. If we make our voices heard, if our government truly represents us, then the only people we'll have to blame is ourselves, and we'll hopefully have something that we all can believe in, and perhaps change that perspective so that a few more people can raise their hands and say they believe in politics. So that's about all I want to talk about today, and I'd love to answer questions about the process, but again, please get involved. Thanks.
I think we can all hear each other. There is some time for questions or comments for any of the three of us or all of the three of us. Before I get to that, I do want to say, picking up on what Professor Hinton said, in every American government course I've ever taught, whenever I hear students say that these politicians, you can't trust them, I always turn it back on the students themselves and say, well, what are you doing about it? And I do think the importance of getting involved and not be overestimating what's so crucial. And so it's my comments to that. But are there any questions or comments? institutions in last years, or the question is, how do you start getting involved in politics? I think for a lot of people, where to begin. I think especially in the information age, when things are being thrown at you from all directions, it can be confusing. So what do we say to that? How do we start getting involved?
I can talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
So post-COVID, I got pretty actively involved in politics. Many of us may be registered with one of the two major parties in our country, either Democrat or Republican. Fantastic. If that's the case, then there are institutions in your neighborhood, in your community, throughout the state that you can talk to. Most towns have Democratic and Republican town committees where you already have a local base for people that broadly share your political ideology. So that was the place where I first got involved. And in doing so, you meet your community members. It's not, you meet your neighbors. And you meet those that share your ideas and want to advocate for those ideas in your community. So the local town committees, I think, are a great doorway into politics. If you are not a member of one of the major parties in our country, there are plenty of organizations. You can focus on specific issues, whether it's immigration, taxation, or whatever it is. There are plenty of nonprofit organizations that are specifically developed to advocate for that one issue. I'm a member of one in Norwich, the Pride Committee in Norwich, Connecticut, which is specifically about gay rights within my town. And we don't talk about political parties. We don't talk about endorsing candidates. We do talk about the issue. So I'd say focus on the local level, and it's very, very easy if you are a demonstrated leader or you want to have your voice heard on a larger platform. 4 years ago, I was not a member of DTC. I joined in 2020, and now I'm going to be a statewide candidate. And that's solely by showing up to these meetings, showing up in person, talking to people, picking up chairs, putting chairs away in the spare room at your library, and spending an hour with community members. That's a huge way to feel as if I've affected some change in my community that I'm proud of.
Just to add to that point, we got this. Did you all hear me now? But, you know, it should be obvious that local politics is most important because the politicians at the local level are the ones that most impact what happens at the community level. They're also, in theory at least, the most responsible people, right? But ironically, it's local elections where voter turnout is lowest. Like as little as 15 to 20% of people vote in local elections. And we lament the fact that at the presidential level, about half to 60% of the people vote. So it's even more dismal at the local level. And it should be the exact opposite. Local politics should be the thing that matters most because it affects us every day. And yet we tune that out. So I think it starts there for me, that you really have to take an interest in your communities and what's happening. And if everybody did that at the local level, I think we'd have a much better country regardless of all of it. Good. Any other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I think a lot of people view voting as voting for the lesser of two evils,
Right.
like that pessimistic view that you guys were talking about. And I was just wondering, how do you think people could change their mindset, I guess, on that, and I guess take a step towards voting in a more positive way?
I think I can probably jump in. I mean, I think in many ways that, you know, this idea of the lesser of two evils, you know, it's the nature of our system. We have a two-party system, and you know, the way the system works is that it's designed to kind of appeal. The parties have to appeal to as many people as possible. But, certainly ideas are going to be left behind. I would encourage ultimately, that to be educated on different ways of doing things. Like, I think that becoming aware of, for example, proportional representation, in which votes are awarded in different ways, to compare, for example, to the political system of Germany or Canada, and to ultimately push for that sort of change is something that I think is ultimately, to me, I think it's going to be one of the most important things for the survival of our political system. I personally think that the two-party system is, the degree of polarization has gotten just incredibly destructive. And so, I would say work to change it. As hard as that may be, it may take a constitutional amendment. But before that is the case, though, I think that we all have to make peace with the fact that this is what we have. And that even if it's the lesser of two evils, having a say in that is more important than just choosing to ignore it or reject it.
So to add on to that, I share the pessimism, and I wish we had a more proportional representative democracy. Perhaps we might see parliamentary systems, right? But I think, lesser of two evils. We could flip that question on its head, right? Is the glass half full or half empty? Are we voting for the lesser of two evils? We could look at it that way, or we could look at it as if we're voting for something that's closer to our values, and then move them closer to our values in successive elections, right? So I personally have never met, I've never encountered a political leader who has represented 100% of my beliefs. But by moving towards my beliefs, I agree with this person or this person. Just in my voting lifetime, there has been, I've noticed, a nudge slowly towards values that I share with individuals. So if we can look at it as a lesser of two evils, that might be the half-empty perspective. I choose to look at it from a half-full perspective and think that maybe I'll get a little bit more water in my cup eventually. It seems to be going that way, despite the pessimism.
I guess a slightly different take, although I agree with what was just said. I think to the extent that we think it's the lesser of two evils, and I'm not indicting you, that those think that, they're all saying it's the lesser of two evils, are not actually looking oftentimes at what the candidates actually represent. That they're not doing their homework, that they're not going out and doing the dirty work, figuring out what these candidates actually stand for. And so it's very easy for us to say, well, that is a cop-out. So that's one thing.
All right.
Second thing is, yes, we do live in a two-party system, but it doesn't have to be that way necessarily just because it's been that way. I would argue that if you don't like the two parties, after you've done your homework and investigated it thoroughly, what you ought to do is go out and form your own coalitions, your own parties. We have a speaker in our third, or the last, I think, is when we talk about the independent movement. It's not gaining traction, but at the local level, we have a speaker by the name of Jessica Waterhouse who didn't like the Democrats or Republicans in her town, so she formed a third party, and she's in power now, sharing her power with Democrats. So for me, it gets back to the same thing. What are average people, ordinary citizens doing to affect change in the system? Not that this person is just as evil as that one, or he's slightly less evil. That to me is just not what we want to do in our discussion. We have more questions. Yes, I don't have questions.
So, around the country, we have a primary that will wait the lesser vote can't find. But in California, they
fast right after this, but I think reform of primaries is incredibly important. If you look at the opinion of political scientists and commentators, for example, I think there's a very strong case to be made that the way the primaries are now is much more geared towards extremism, particularly when you put primaries into non-competitive general elections due to gerrymandering and other things like this, because of the fact that very few people voted primaries. So ultimately, the most dedicated primaries tend to be more ideological, tend to be more extreme in their views. So I really think that, yes, there is something to be said for changing primaries in a way that is less prone towards producing more extremist candidates. So I think it's a wonderful, wonderful idea. I 100% endorse that idea personally.
I also love tier coding. Tier coding, like the other way, is another system.
Yeah, so I just want to thank both Professor and Professor Fauss for joining us today. I'd be happy to answer more questions, although I don't know if you all can stick around, but if you can, I'm here. Got nothing else going on. Any other questions? Oh, sure. The other two, please, and no questions are left from this. Okay, yes?
I'll give you a quick question. So,
Sure.
now there being this debate on age limits for a political candidate, do you believe that there should be an age limit, or maybe a mental health test or something that could limit political figures? And for example, this young figure by the name of Swami, do you think he will have a big impact considering his age on the younger generation?
Right. Well, for those of you who don't know Vivek Ramaswamy, he was on the Republican side. He was in the primary. He eventually got out and is now supporting Trump. Perhaps he's aiming for some sort of cabinet position. Quite young, quite articulate. He's energetic. Some would even say charismatic. And he may appeal to a younger generation of voters. I think if we go down the road of cognitive tests, though, I don't think we can restrict that to the elderly. There are lots of people who should be taking a cognitive test who are, quite young. I don't know that that has anything to do with anything per se. I think in the end, the American people should decide whether someone is impaired or not, whether someone is too old or not, and let democracy play itself out. That's my position on that. I do think, though, that there should be a lot of more energetic, younger political leaders emerging, and the American people ought to take the time to find out who these up-and-coming people are. There are lots of them at the local and state level. It's just a matter of getting to know them and what they stand for. At the national level, in some ways, I always hesitate to put these kinds of events on national politics because it misses the point of how important local or state politics are. That's really where it's at when it comes to what gets done and how efficient the system is. As interesting as national politics are, and whether Joe Biden is too old, Trump is right behind him, by the way. I don't know. I think that ultimately it comes down to the American people deciding. Thank you. Any other questions? I also, by the way, want to thank Nick Kopka. He is an SGA. Are you the president of SGA? He's the vice president of SGA. He sent me an email a few days ago saying that from now on, all our civic engagement events will have cookies and water and paid for, funded by the SGA. It was very, very nice of him. I was ecstatic to see that. Yes, that's why there was such a good turnout. The alternative is me literally begging some administrator for money. Thank you very much.
So you said
Thank you all.
No age limit, right? Age limit, let people vote. But like then you can flip it and say, sure, 20-year-old run for president. Should we get rid of age limits for governors, senators, president?
Yeah, obviously, there was a reason initially why those age limits were put in place. And I don't know that those reasons are as valid as they were. Why should someone who's 35 run for president? That seems to be a random cutoff. But in order to change the Constitution, you have to pass an amendment, and that's not easy to do, right? It requires the approval of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states. That also gets back to the Congress. Constitutional amendments require consideration of law. So if you want younger politicians, get at it. All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate you all coming, and have a good day.